The Archdiocese of Chicago is a vibrant and diverse faith community. We celebrate our faith through worship, evangelization, and reaching out to the needy. Welcome to Catholic Chicago.
Hello, and thanks for listening to our program here today and watching us here on the Catholic Conference Hour. It's actually not going to be quite an hour today. We're just going to do one segment that we hope to get out to you very soon here. Today is the 17th of October, and we're going to be promoting an event and talking to the primary speaker at that event, Dr. Jason Eberl, who is a professor at St. Louis University. He is going to be speaking at the Diocese of Springfield White Mass that happens every year down in Springfield Diocese. And it's an event that's attended by many people. And so if you can listen to our broadcast or find out about it, I strongly recommend that you see if you can come out and meet us on the 22nd of October. So Jason here is going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that he's been writing about recently. He's a professor at St. Louis University, and he's going to be talking about a Catholic perspective on defining end of life and Catholic healthcare. Jason, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here, Bob.
Hey, good to be with you. Thanks for joining here today to talk a little bit about your upcoming presentation at the Diocese of Springfield White Mass. I should say, I hope you the best of luck. I hope you rival the first speaker they had at the White Mass, who was me. So I don't think they could.
That'll be a hard act to follow for sure.
I honestly think they kind of put it together. They had nobody, so they asked me, and I talked about it. And you know what? Ironically, I remember talking. It was a Saturday night, and I remember talking about the topic we were going to be talking about here 9 years later. I talked a little bit about assisted suicide and the importance of Catholic healthcare and how we treat those at the end of life. And I know you've dedicated a lot of your career talking about that. Tell us a little bit about what you do at St. Louis U and what you write about in general before we get into the topic today.
Yeah, great. Well, again, thank you so much for having me on, and I appreciate all those who are listening in. So again, I'm Jason Eberl. I'm a professor of healthcare ethics and philosophy, and I am the director of the Gnaegi Center for Healthcare Ethics here at St. Louis University. I'm also currently, for the next 2 years, president of the Association of Bioethics Program Directors, which represents the leadership of bioethics programs, both secular and Catholic, across North America. And yeah, I'm going to be speaking at the Diocesan White Mass coming up next week on the Catholic perspective on how we understand, how we define death, and then how do we accompany those who are going through the dying process. And a lot of this ties in, with current debates that are happening. I know in Illinois as well as other states about legalization of physician-assisted suicide and the Catholic perspective on that.
One of the things that we've talked about on this program before, and we continue to talk about, is the proponents of legislation to enact assisted suicide have a very compelling emotional argument. And our hearts go out to those people at the end of life. Nobody wants to suffer pain at the end of life. And I've been told that nobody should be suffering inordinate pain at the end of life, because today we have the medical technology and the capability to provide care and comfort for those at the end of life. We hear too, interestingly, that in the state of Oregon, which unfortunately has had assisted suicide since 1997, I think it was, when they ask people, like, why do you want to do this to yourself at the end of life? And there's a number of different answers that people provide. But I find it interesting that pain is, I think, number 4 on the list of responses, and which contradicts their main argument legislatively on why they want this legislation. And people often say because they feel that they're a burden at the end of their life to their family and friends. They feel like they've lost their autonomy. They feel like they can no longer do what they normally did in their life when they were healthier. Can you speak to a little bit about that? Because I think that's one of the things that I find so tragic as a society, that we're failing people at the end of life instead of we're accompanying them, as you mentioned, in what is one of the most difficult things to deal with, which is that, you may have a terminal illness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Oregon, those statistics coming out of Oregon are very informative. And as you said, kind of undercut one of the main reasons, that's given by proponents for physician-assisted suicide. I think what's happening is there is again a lot of intuitive pull in modern society in favor of allowing people to choose the means by which they end their lives, particularly if they're terminally ill or suffering, in their view, intolerably. And I think it comes out of a confluence of a lot of very modern values. So, for example, autonomy, right? That's a very contemporary, particularly Western, particularly American value that we emphasize, right? The rights of the individual to self-determination. Um, the idea that that pain is like the worst evil we should avoid at all costs, even in this case, choosing death to avoid pain and suffering. The idea that pain and suffering can have no potential value for a person. Um, and finally, this idea of again not wanting to be a burden, which again kind of ties in, I think, with that sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, rugged individualism that is very much a part of the American ethos. I think the confluence of all those comes together to support, and we see this come out in the reasons people give for why they want the option of physician-assisted suicide. So what do we have to do as the church? Well, we need to counter that with our ethos that recognizes that dependency and vulnerability are not bad things. That yes, autonomy and self-determination is important, but it has limits, right? We're all also children of God, and we're stewards of our lives, not owners of our lives. And finally, recognizing that pain and suffering is not the worst evil, nor is even death the worst evil. Um, and so, finding ways to help someone to transmute their pain and suffering into something that can allow them to approach death in a more dignified way, right? Proponents of assisted suicide use that term death with dignity. Well, we talk a lot about dignity too in Catholicism, and we need to re-emphasize our notion of a dignified death.
It's interesting also that the main advocacy group is called Compassion and Choices, which I find that name interesting. I would argue that there's other ways to be compassionate to someone at the end of their life rather than assisting in them to end their own life. One of the things I think that's interesting right now that's going on, just as a thought I had, is one of the other reasons that, one of the safeguards, they will call them, as to prevent misuse for the assisted suicide pill that could end one's life, the prescription of it. The proponents will often say, well, you have to have at least a terminal diagnosis that you have less than 6 months to live. I think that's what the legislation is in Illinois. And I don't know if you can speak to this at all, but anybody that gets a terminal illness, and when you're told that, I cannot imagine what the individual's experiencing, that panic, that depression, that anxiety, what's going to happen to them, et cetera. Yet, right now, I don't know if you saw recently, but former President Jimmy Carter just voted in the state of Georgia. I think he had a terminal diagnosis like 2 years ago. Now, he's in feeble health. I don't want to argue that he's dancing around, but I think the man is 100 years old if I read it correctly. And so, my point is you can long outlive a terminal diagnosis, and you could act in such a way when you get that terminal diagnosis to end your life when you may have runway left in your life and you could become you could still be somewhat productive. And in my example to you, Jimmy Carter got to vote for the person that he wanted to vote for, that he wouldn't have had the opportunity to do so if he had ended his life when he first got that diagnosis.
Yeah. So, going back to this notion of, sort of these, modern or postmodern values that I think are coming into play in a lot of this discussion. Another is ableism. The idea that one's life only has value or has quality insofar as one is a quote unquote productive member of society, or insofar as one is able to do the things that they want to do, to fulfill their preferences. And again, I think we need to counter that with the Catholic ethos that life is intrinsically valuable. Life has inherent dignity. That, even though, former President Carter is able to still do some things like cast a vote and so on, not sure, what much else it has to do. Just his very existence is a sign of dignity, right? Just his very life is a sign of is dignified. And yes, in addition, he's able to do things and fulfill interests and preferences. And so we tend to kind of reduce again, quality of life or the dignity of life to simply being able to do things. And if I can't do things or do the things that I used to do, then my life loses value for me. And so we need to kind of move away from that idea towards an idea of it's not about what you can do, it's simply about your being and being a person of love, love that you both give and love that you receive. People shouldn't be afraid to be a burden on their families. Those of us who have children, our children were, quote unquote, a burden on us as parents when we were raising
That's
them.
right.
It's our turn when we get older, right, for them to take care of us, for them to show us the love that we had shown them. That's reciprocity, right?
I'm glad you brought that up because in my example before, I also glossed over, but I want to highlight this a little bit more, is that the reasons that people want to end their lives sometimes can be addressed by a stronger family network if they had it, or a societal obligation to reach out to provide some social services so they're in more of a comfortable position. I guess my observation is part of the cry for assisted suicide also in part kind of an indication of maybe breakdown in the family and family structure and how we are just a little bit more disconnected to each other than we used to be in previous generations.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's, again, sort of culturally endemic in modern Western and particularly American culture, where we talk about the nuclear family, right, ever since the 1950s. And the nuclear family is parents and children. And, maybe the grandparents live on the other side of town or something. But, people geographically spread out much more ever since then. And the idea of having multiple generations of family members living not just in the same city or in the same neighborhood, but even in the same household, is very foreign to a lot of our experiences. And so what do? We create nursing homes and in hospice care facilities and other types of long-term care facilities. We've lost that sense. And to be clear, there are times when, as a person is aging or suffering some sort of debilitating condition, where they do reach a point
Yes.
of ability that it is no longer possible for the family to adequately care for them. That there is, justifiable reasons for someone to go into some sort of long-term care facility. I'm not at all denying that. But oftentimes that tends to become the first option as opposed to the last option. And people are often unwilling to make sacrifices to, again, show that reciprocal care for their parents or grandparents or others who are in need. Again, it's the same logic that informs the ableism that underlies certain abortions that occur, where a fetus is diagnosed with some sort of congenital anomaly that's going to mean it has Down syndrome or spina bifida or cystic fibrosis, and it's too hard. It's going to be too hard to care for this child. And again, for some people, it might be too hard to care for them if, as you mentioned, social support mechanisms aren't put into place. So that's also part of the accompaniment that Pope Francis and the church as a whole is calling us to provide, both individually within our families and also through social mechanisms to help families to provide that care.
The debate right now has been interesting because I think, at least in Illinois, one of the reasons that the legislation is not advanced really at all, they haven't had a hearing yet, is in large part due to the advocacy of not only us, but the disability community as well. They are sort of the personification of a vulnerable population that a lawmaker or the public can see, who will say to lawmakers and the public, like, look, just by the fact of my existence in this wheelchair or this visible disability that I have, I get substandard treatment already. And I'm definitely concerned about how this could be misused. Do you see that all in your writings or your experience about the advocacy of those communities and other vulnerable populations?
Oh, very much so. Both I and some of my faculty colleagues here at St. Louis University, Miguel Romero, who's a disability theologian, Harold Broswell, who is not Catholic but is a disability bioethicist. All of us have written to various extents on the importance of the disability perspective on all sorts of issues that rise in bioethics, but particularly this one, because again, if society has limited resources, and as Scripture says, where your treasure is, that's where your heart lies. And where we as a society choose to invest our economic resources is indicative of of where's our heart as a culture, right? Both Pope Francis and John Paul II speak at length about the culture of life, culture of death, throwaway culture, culture of encounter. Um, and so the issue from the disability perspective is, yeah, it needs to be an investment of resources to accommodate those with various types of physical or intellectual disabilities to live flourishing lives, right? To be able to express the dignity that they have as persons. And if we choose not to offer them those accommodations, but instead offer them this quote unquote way out,
Mm-hmm.
or again, offer parents of a child that may be born with a disability a way out through abortion, then that's saying something significant about who we are as a people.
I think we're also starting to see that a little bit as these stories from states that have legalized assisted suicide and what's going on in other countries, where you see those safeguards being eliminated, which are slowly but surely leading to people who are not experiencing a terminal diagnosis, are not at the end of life, but yet they are able now, due to the law changes, to statutory changes in those states, to end their lives because they're homeless or they need various things. And that I think is giving legislators some pause about this whole idea. And maybe it's being sort of sold to them in a way that was not exactly the way it's being presented. But time will tell in terms of what happens with legislation and things like that, because that's a whole other political argument. Doctor, I also noticed that your talk, and I don't mean to take your whole talk here, that's going to happen on the 22nd of October in Springfield, but you also, I think you have a section in your topic that's sort of defining the end of life. I know when I first was more exposed to these topics professionally, I would hear people talking about, and you'll hear this in Catholic circles, talking about it, praying for a good death. And I remember like being a younger person thinking like, oh, that's kind of weird. I don't think that anymore. I kind of understand it. Talk a little bit about defining end of life and what your research indicates on that.
Yeah. So the main issue on the table, there's multiple different issues, but ever since we invented technology in the 1950s and 60s to sustain the bodies of persons who would otherwise just be dead unequivocally, unquestionably, um, but we're able to use mechanical ventilators, later cardiopulmonary bypass machines, later what's called ECMO, to keep oxygenated blood flowing through the body. But the patients are neurologically devastated, meaning they're not only comatose as we think of like, like on a soap opera, someone's, comatose for 6 months and they wake and their sisters marry their brother and all those weird things happen in soap opera. But they're truly, their brain is completely non-functional, right? And what this means is not only are they irreversibly comatose, but they also cannot spontaneously respire on their own. And without that, their heart's going to stop beating, and they'd be dead. But again, we can bypass the heart-lung functions and get oxygenated blood flowing through the body, but with no brain function. And so this led to the development of what's colloquially known as brain death. That's not a technical way we would put it, but the idea that a person can be declared dead either by traditional cardiopulmonary criteria or neurological based criteria. And that's been something we've been doing since the early 1980s with the Uniform Determination of Death Act in the U.S. The church has affirmed brain death as a valid criterion since a statement from John Paul II in 2001. But yet there's debate about this, both in secular bioethics and within Catholic bioethics. And there have been really provocative cases, such as one is about 10 years ago now, a young woman named Jahai McMath, who was determined to be dead by neurological criteria, but her family didn't accept that and kept either her body or her, depending on one's view, alive on mechanical ventilation for another 5 years until her body finally succumbed to liver failure. And so, did she die in 2013 or did she die in 2018? And that's a huge point of debate and something which Catholic bioethicists ourselves are very much divided on. In fact, there's an upcoming symposium that's going to be at the Catholic University of America in February, and I'll be one of the speakers at that, where we're going to be doing our best to hash this out in a collegial, professional manner. We are all trying to aim for the truth. We're all trying to understand the truth of, when do we have enough certitude? We never have 100% certitude, but when do we have what we call moral certitude or prudential certitude, that when we turn off the ventilator, or more specifically, the issue is when we start explanting organs for transplant from this brain dead body, that the person is no longer present.
Right, right. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, due to this modern technology and our cultural shifts that are underway, you have a lot to write about it, a lot to research. So I'm sure you're going to be plenty busy in the next couple of years ahead. So once again, I'll just make one more plug for Dr. Earl's presentation. That will be on, that is next week already. I can't believe it's October 22nd. I still think this is a long way away, but it's not. It's as soon as next week.
Right.
He's going to be speaking at Diocesan White Mass, and on the screen you can see a promo. If you're interested in attending that, you can call the diocese, and there is a QR code, believe it or not, I think on there somewhere. There you go. It'll be at the Eberl Institute, which is recently created by Bishop Paprocki down in the Springfield Diocese. There'll be plenty of medical professionals there from HSHS, the Hospital Sisters Healthcare System in the Springfield Diocese, as well as others from the public. So I strongly recommend, if anybody's interested, to come out and listen to the talk that night. And I guarantee you, you will be better than the speaker the very first night they had this presentation. I guarantee you that. You're going to have a low bar to clear.
Well, I will take your word for that, but I doubt it.
I think I had some good jokes about the Cubs because they were in the World Series about that time. So I think, and Bishop Paprocki's a White Sox fan, so I remember talking about that. It didn't turn out well because I think that's the year the Cubs won the World Series. All right, Jason, thank you so much for taking some time today, and I'll be there. I'm going to come down and listen to your talk, and perhaps we'll meet in person then.
Oh, wonderful. I look forward to it.
Great. Thank you so much for taking some time. This is Bob Gilligan of the Catholic Conference of Illinois. And once again, thanks for watching our podcast or program, whatever we're calling these things these days. As I mentioned, please, if you're interested, make some time and get down to Springfield on the 22nd of October. Listen to Jason's talk. We're going to be back in the month of November to talk about more public policy topics, as the election will finally be over on November 5th. And we will make a transition back to Springfield, where the legislature will be reconvening the week after the election. The second week in November. And then we'll be off for the exciting lame duck session in the first week of January. Plenty to talk about then. Until then, this is Bob Gilligan of the Catholic Conference of Illinois, and thank you for watching our program. Have a good day.
Join us every Monday through Friday at this time for Catholic Chicago. You can stream our programs live or listen to past programs by visiting our website, archchicago.org, and clicking on Radio TV. And please connect with Catholic Chicago on social media.